You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
Our guest on this week's edition of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, is investigative journalist and American Free Press editor, Pat Shannan. Pat has been covering the beats for longer than I've been alive. He covered the Kennedy assassination. He covered the MLK assassination. He covered the RFK assassination. He covered the moon landing. He covered the assassination of the Pope. He covered the assassination or the attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, the assassination of John Lennon. And he's covered a lot of news over the years that has absolutely nothing to do with assassinations. Just trying to give you a little bit of a pedigree on Pat Shannan. And he's also one of our Dixie Heritage subscribers. And so when I found that out, I said, wow, I have got to get this guy on our radio show. And so I reached out to Pat, and he immediately said, oh, I'd love to be on the show. And so he's our guest today, and we're going to talk about a number of things. Just kind of a teaser to keep you tuned in. Pat has verifiable reporting that there have been 7 assassination attempts on President Trump that are not being reported by the news media. So you'll definitely want to stay tuned to the broadcast. But right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take us straight into our interview with Pat Shannan.
In your book, Everything They Ever Told Me Was a Lie, I guess start by telling us what inspired you to write a book by such a title.
It's an interesting story, so I'm glad you asked. About more than 10 years ago, I'd say it was about 04, 05, a friend of mine, he was a jailhouse lawyer type who was very much into stuff the government doesn't want exposed, and he ended up getting framed on he got 3 years in Atlanta federal pen down the road here, and he and his wife were both very good friends of mine, and one day I took her to lunch, and I said, how's Ken doing? And she said, fine, and she visits every Saturday morning, and she met a lot of people in the waiting room there that were waiting to see relatives. And one was a man in his 80s, and his son was in his 50s, and he was in there for an IRS fight, and the bogus federal court had railroaded him. But anyway, Donna was talking with this elder man who was a World War II veteran, wounded at Iwo Jima, had a Purple Heart, just all American all through and through. And here he is visiting his son in the federal penitentiary, a son who has harmed no one. And with tears in his voice as he told my friend this story about his son and how he got there. And he said, and you know, young lady, everything they ever told me was a lie. And I said, wow, Donna, what a book title. I was already in the middle of beginning it and compiling it, but I said, that's the title for my book. So that's where it came from.
One of the first things that struck me as interesting is you had a section of lawful money versus the Fed's counterfeit legal tender.
Yes, sir. It's my favorite subject, actually, because to me everything revolves around it. The modern day root of all evil today is a legal tender. And I talk to kids, a generation, they're not kids anymore, but people in their 40s and 50s, a generation behind me. And they don't understand that they're paying $1 or more for what I paid a nickel. And they don't understand that the prices have not increased, but the value of the money has nosedived. And of course that happened in 1965, finally, when they stole the silver. It was initiated long before that, of course, even before the founding of the Fed. So the money masters were in bad trouble by the turn of the century, by 1900. They were already in bad trouble. And in 1907, they pretty much faked that panic of '07 to create the problem to get the private banksters going by 1913. And as you well know, I'm sure, December 23rd, 1913, they passed the Federal Counterfeiting Act, Federal Reserve Act, and it was a lie from the beginning. First of all, the people were assured that even though we were going to paper currency and the circulating gold and silver coin would not be the lawful money anymore, or prevail, I should say, But they told from the start that the money would be 100%, I should say the currency would be 100% backed by gold from the beginning. Well, that was the first big lie that we were ever told by the banksters, because there never was more than 40% in there in 1914 when they opened their doors the first time. And that began to dwindle to 25, and by the time the 1980s came along, when I became interested in the subject matter, we were down to 5%. Everyone is pretty much convinced it's 0% today. There's no backing whatsoever, and then that's how.
Well, I'll tell you a story, Pat, and this probably won't surprise you, but I'll tell it for the sake of our listeners.
Right.
And I'm one of those 45-year-olds, by the way, but although I do understand a little bit more than a lot of my contemporaries about the evils of the banking system. But when I was a teenager, I had an uncle who was in the Marine Corps. And one of his first assignments between basic training and his first real furlough, when I was able to see him again, was as a guard at Fort Knox. And so I asked him what it was like to see all that gold in the vault. And he told me that the vault was only opened one time in his presence. And only one time was he able to look inside, he said, and it was empty. He was guarding an empty vault.
Yeah, I'm not surprised at all. And, of course, the rumors had it that it was either in Rockefeller's Chase Manhattan or maybe even in Tel Aviv. Who knows where it went. We also know, you may remember this, but back in 2008, they sent the fake gold over to China, pretending to pay a debt. China weighed it out and found out it was bogus and sent it back. You remember that incident?
No, I don't.
Caught me off guard here. I can't think of the metal. I will in a minute, but there's one that's so close to the density of gold that it's very, very difficult to detect it. And I forget what metal it is. It's a well-known element. Anyway.
So does that mean that we need to stop buying gold coins on eBay?
Yes, it certainly does. There's a lot of bogus ones out there. I can point you off the air to some honest dealers if you're looking for one, but we can't trust it. Back in the 80s, I operated a gold and silver exchange I was a satellite of NCBA, National Commodity and Barter Association. Another one that was destroyed by IRS because of the privacy we were offering people. But I used to handle that. One time I actually got a 100-ounce alleged bar of silver, or bar of alleged silver, I should say, and it was lead. It had been drilled and filled, and I became wary then, of course, what was going on, but didn't happen very much amongst the Patriot bunch, and whoever gave me this may have not known it was bogus either. He may have acquired it from somebody else. But meanwhile, I'm getting things in the mail of this year, and they're talking about one just last week was hawking silver bars, they call it. Well, the only silver bars that I ever called bars were 10 ounces or 100 ounces. You know, the others were 1-ounce coins and rounds, they call them, but they never called them bars. And here they wanted $200 and something for this 99.9% pure, blah, blah, blah. Come to find out, we really got down deep into the small print on this flyer they sent me. They were 1-ouncers. They were selling 1-ouncers for $200 and something bucks.
Wow.
So we got to beware.
You'd also talk about the inside forces working with the Oklahoma City bombers.
Yes, but let's finish a little bit on the history on the money before we get away from it. Can we?
Yeah, sure. We can stay there as long as you want to.
All right. Well, just another few minutes, but by the time we came along to the 60s, the legal tender series, the last one I think was 1950, until 1963, and I'm sure you probably read, you know that the 63 edition of Federal Reserve notes was released to the public the week of John F. Kennedy's funeral. Great time to bury it in the back pages of the New York Times and elsewhere. I remember seeing one somewhere around the first of the year of 64, I was of major age by then, and the age of majority, and I was riding with my dad, who was in insurance business, and we were going to the post office, and I got one of these in change. I remember talking with him about it. I said, "Guys, it looks so counterfeit." I actually used that word in my 20s, and of course, I didn't know anything about lawful money or Federal Reserve notes or anything else. But I just remember saying, "It looks so counterfeit, Dad." And I'll forget.
They had the red ink on instead of the green ink on them.
Say again?
I said at least a couple of them that I've seen had red ink instead of green ink.
Yeah. Well, anyway, Dad says, "Well, yeah, but if the U.S. government's behind it, son, you don't have to worry about it." And that reflected, as I think back on it 50 years later, that reflected the attitude of Americans. I call it red, white, and blue fever today. We're supposed to cheer and back and support the troops where we are invading 142 foreign countries, and we're supposed to support that. But that's red, white, and blue fever. Well, the red, white, and blue fever, of course, came from World War II, when it was well earned and deserved. But here we got now in '63 the notes that are coming out, and these notes circulated with lawful notes. And I still carry one in my wallet. I give Pat Shannan's 10-minute coffee shop seminar sometimes with a lawful pre-65 coin and the lawful Federal Reserve note that, of course, was this note is legal tender for all debts public and private and is redeemable at any Federal Reserve Bank of the United States Treasury. That meant we could walk in with that Federal Reserve note and collect our silver coin any time we demanded it. Now, they circulated together these bogus notes, the ones that suddenly said this was legal tender and nothing else. The actual paper had become instead of being the receipt for the lawful money, the gold and silver on deposit, it actually became the token, is what it was. Now we got the tokens and the lawful notes circulating together. The lawful notes were being pulled in the 65, 6, 7, and 8. And every time they would show up in the bank, the tellers had instructed to turn them into the Fed. And on June the 24th, 1968, was the last day that you could redeem one of those lawful notes for your silver coin. That's the day the window slammed shut. And from that point forward, we have had 100% inflation in this country every day. Every time they print another legal tender bill, it's 100% inflationary. They can come up with all the magic figures they want, about 4% and 8% and 2% and 10%. But every one of them is bogus, and for that reason, it cannot fund anything. That piece of paper, as I wrote in the book, is worth no more than a handful of sand to a beachcomber, because the Fed gets to print all they want, and we have to work for them. And that's why I paid a nickel for a Coca-Cola back in the 60s, and you have to pay $1 or $1.50. So that's the history of money that Americans do not understand. They cannot understand because it's just been educated right out of them. And people I talked to today, I got involved a little bit with some cryptocurrency in the last couple of years. And people say, "Well, how soon can I double my money?" And I would say, why would you want to sell an appreciating crypto coin for depreciating paper? It's the paper that we need to get out of. And it's getting serious now, as I'm sure you know. It's really getting serious when the so-called dollars is 99% gone.
Well, I've tried to explain that to a few people.
It ain't easy.
Some of them get it and some of them don't. But the reason, for example, because for years you would travel to Mexico, for example, and the Mexican dollar was, took however many thousands or then hundreds of pesos to equal a U.S. dollar. Now it just takes about 10 of them. Or, you'd go to Canada and the value of the Canadian money was half of the U.S. dollar. And I've tried to explain to some people, and some of them do get it, but some of them don't. It's not that the Mexican peso is getting stronger or the Canadian dollar is getting stronger. It's that the U.S. dollar is getting weaker.
All right. Obama printed everything he wanted and from the so-called $10 trillion debt. in 8 years went to 20 trillion. Well, do you think the taxpayers did that? All they did was run their printing presses. Taxpayers' money. If you ever send them a check rather than withholding, but if you ever have to mail a check to the IRS, look on the back of it. See how it was endorsed. It was endorsed right over to the Federal Reserve Bank. It didn't go in the U.S. Treasury. There is no U.S. Treasury. It's all bogus. Yes.
You had mentioned those United States Treasury notes that were circulated briefly in the 60s.
No, they were actually Federal Reserve notes, but they were lawful notes because they were redeemable. In '63, after Kennedy's funeral that same week, they came out with the bogus ones that just claimed to be legal tender, but there was no redeemability clause anymore. But they both were Federal Reserve notes. One was a lawful note. It had a payor, it had a payee, it had a specified amount, it had a due date. Any sophomore law student can tell you that's what a bona fide note is.
Okay, because I've got some $2 bills. And they say United States Treasury note on the top of them. They don't say Federal.
Yeah, well, that's a separate thing, though. The old Federal Reserve note, if we were sitting down together having coffee, I could show you one. I keep one in my wallet.
Okay. But see, I was always of the opinion that it was probably those Treasury notes that got Kennedy murdered.
Oh, that's a long time, strongly held opinion of many in recent history. I don't think so, and if you look at Ed Griffin's book, do you have a copy of The Creature from Jekyll Island?
Yes, sir, I do. I haven't read it in years.
All right, I think it's on page 569. It's over here on my shelf. But you can, that he explains why that was not so, because they were talking about silver certificates, and what he did was renew something with that executive. Was it 1 Quint 011 or something? Anyway, his famous executive order actually only backed up what Harry Truman had done in 1950 and superseded him. But while we're on the subject, I agree with Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, who he tied, I thought, the strong. And I, by the way, I think I have 6 potential motives there in the book you're talking about, my book, but I thought the strongest one, and I agree with Garrison, that was his choice, was the Vietnam War, that the military-industrial complex had to have a war at that time, and Kennedy's mistake was pulling out. He was bringing home 1,000 men by Christmas, and all of them by the 64th, the following year, and he decided to do that in September. The money, however, you may not know, but it was pretty strange that he signed that executive order that you speak of, and Ed Griffin does, and in June the 4th of '63, he signed that, and come November 22nd, when he's murdered on a Friday, they had those notes already ready in circulation, ready to go the following week. I don't think they ran they designed it and ran the printing presses on Saturday and Sunday and started, going on Monday. I don't think so. They had been in line for a long time, so in preparation. So, and these sorts of plans, such as this, and go very deep. They are well planned, and I just believe it was Kennedy's decision to pull out of Vietnam that put a date on it. That's when they said, okay, he's got to go.
We're going to pause there, Pat, and we're going to take just a moment for a word from our sponsor, the Barnes Review. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review.
Well, I remember reading in Nixon's I can't remember if it was in his diary or if it was in one of his autobiographies. I don't remember. But Nixon made the statement that he wasn't afraid of being assassinated because he said that assassination was overdone in the 60s. But
assassination was what in the 60s?
Had been overdone in the 60s.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I see. With MLK and RFK, yeah.
Yeah, and so FK and everything else. Yeah, so he thought that assassination was overdone in the 60s. So he thought the 70s was probably going to be a safe decade. But
well, George Wallace found out that wasn't true.
Yeah, but Nixon, Nixon saw other political pressures, as we know. But President Trump, every day I wake up and the first thing I do is check to see if the president's still alive.
Yeah.
And of course, President Trump was going to take the troops out of Syria just a few weeks ago, and we know how that turned out.
Yeah. Well, we got to understand, Trump has done a remarkable job, but he's got a gun to his head. He's walking a tightrope, man. I'm sure he had no idea he was getting into the mess he was getting into when he ran for president. But he found out the inside power, the deep state, everything that's going on, the controlled mass media won't let us know about.
Right. And you talked.
Yes, I found is on your creature. You want to take your time now, but if you look at page 569 and 570 on Ed Griffith's book, I think you might change your mind about the money issue being the thing that killed Kennedy.
Okay, well, thank you. I'll take a look at that afterwards. So you had talked about the inside forces working with Oklahoma City bombers.
I covered that story. So I was there 6 times. I was working at that time in '95 for Chuck Harder and the People's Radio Network, and he called me and said, I smell a rat out here. Can you go to Oklahoma City? I said, sure. So ended up, I was there the first time, May the 23rd. The bombing, of course, was April 19th. The reason I chose I got there on the 22nd, was the 23rd was the day that they were going to destroy all the evidence, demolition of the Murrah building, etc. So I was there at 7 o'clock in the morning, live on the air with Chuck's network, and my favorite statement of being an honest reporter came that morning at 7:03 when I said, "There goes the evidence." I'm sure no other reporter in America said that at the time the Murrah building was coming down. But certainly that's what happened, and during that visit and subsequent, I believe it was a June visit, that I got to meet a guy by the name of Brigadier General Ben Parton. You ever hear of him?
No, sir.
Ben Parton was a retired general, born in 25, so by 95 he was in his 70s, and he had spent 30 years in the Air Force, 25 of them as an instructor in demolition at one of the Air Force's war colleges. I mean, this guy, if you're looking for an expert, here he was. And fortunately, we got to meet him and ended up filming him even on a video much later. But Ben had been sitting in his living room the week after the Oklahoma City bombing, looking at nothing more than Time and Newsweek and U.S. News magazines and pictures on the cover and the inside. And he says to his wife, "Baloney, no ammonium nitrate fuel oil did this." And he could see, once again, just from a magazine story, without ever going to the scene, he could see how the columns in the rear were, first of all, they were more damaged than the ones up front closer to the alleged Ryder truck. But they had that sawn-through look, as it would when you wrap a column with the explosive. So, and the way he explained it to me, he took a pencil in his hand and he broke it. He broke the pencil, and you've done that 1,000 times yourself, and you can see what it looks like when you split a pencil in half, as opposed to what it looked like if you ran it through a jigsaw. And so he sees the jigsaw effect in the columns there in the rear of the building, and he sees less damage on the front columns and the wall, And he went on to explain, and he does it on our video, that the pressure, I'm trying to think of the PSI, there we go, per square inch. And inside the alleged Ryder truck, if there had been barrels of ammonium nitrate fuel oil in there, the pressure would have been 500,000, 500,000 PSI. But it dissipates so quickly that by the time it got to those rear columns, the pressure would have been down about 27 pounds per square inch. In other words, as if a bicycle tire had exploded next to the columns and brought the building down. So he showed the utter impossibility of the ANFO being in a truck out front as anything more than a diversionary tactic, which we kind of conclude just may be what happened. But on the other hand, it may have been nothing in that truck because, once again, as we explained on the video, the foreman of the crew, that janitorial crew and repair crew, whatever you call them, that worked there, full time at the building, he had been in the U.S. courthouse, the building right behind it, the mirror. At the moment of the explosion, he was on the scene, he said, in less than 3 minutes. And nobody was there with the gas mask. Nobody had any trouble with any ammonium nitrate fuel oil fumes. But yet, any of the science boys know that you can't go near an ANFO explosion for at least an hour until all that settles because of what you would be breathing. So we doubt that ANFO was there at all. There probably was some kind of explosion in the truck that was a diversionary thing, but the bombs went off inside the building. They were designed to kill children because that's the way you pluck the heartstrings of Americans. And don't forget, 2 years earlier in New York City, the FBI had instigated that first explosion at the Trade Center and had done it with a bomb inside. They actually paid off this guy, this Arab named Salem, S-A-L-E-M. But he stung the FBI. He recorded them and got them on tape, and he ended up getting $1 million for setting up the thing. But they found that Americans didn't care much about what happened in New York. I think there were 6 people killed and maybe 1,000 or so injured, or at least had smoke inhalation enough to call themselves injured. But that didn't work in 93. And so by 95, they realized they needed to go to the heartland of America. And obviously, they intentionally wanted to murder children because that's where they placed those bombs that General Parton showed us, right over the nursery on the 3rd floor level. The nursery was on the 2nd. So these people are wicked, Ed. They're wicked.
Well, I remember reading this somewhere, but I don't remember where. It was so many years ago that there was some pretty material evidence to some of the Clinton scandals that just conveniently happened to blow up in the Murrah building that day.
Yes. Even one of the Secret Service agents who had worked for Bill Clinton had an office there, and he died. The Whitewater papers allegedly were there, and Hillary was up to her ears at that time with which I think is probably what got Vince Foster murdered as well. But they couldn't find those papers, and somebody suggested that maybe that would have been the motivation for taking down Murrah. We don't really know, for sure, what the real motivation was. It might have been something even bigger than that.
Maybe I'm just cynical, but I remember right after the bombing, I remember seeing the news and the capture of Timothy McVeigh, and I never believed Timothy McVeigh was the culprit for a minute. If for no other reason, I just couldn't believe that a sheriff's deputy who couldn't even bend down and touch his toes to tie his shoes was going to solve the crime of the decade by pulling over some motorist in a traffic stop 5 minutes later. Well,
don't forget, Timothy was also, if he indeed had blown up the building, and this is the first thing that made us suspicious, here he blows up the Murrah building, and he's driving 85 miles an hour up the interstate with no license plate. But what more attention can he draw to himself?
Right.
And that's when the cop pulled him over. He's a bona fide patsy. He was set up, or even since, of course, he allegedly had quit the Army in '92. And here, when he was allegedly executed, we're not sure of that either, by the way, in 2001, his death certificate, I have a copy of it, his death certificate, under the blank space that you fill in, it says employer. It says United States Army.
Wow.
9 years after he's supposed to have quit. So sure, he was CIA all the way. They were handling him just like they handled Oswald, both of them.
Right. You were talking about that first attack on the World Trade Center, not the one in 2001, September 11th, but the one that had happened in, was it, I believe, 1993 maybe?
93, right. Early, I think, February or so.
But shortly after September 11th, I was preaching in Pennsylvania. And there was a gentleman who I knew worked for the Social Security Administration. And I thought he just didn't like what I was preaching, and that was why he got up and walked out in the middle of it. But afterwards, I was in the foyer to the church building, and I was at my book table, and he walks back in. And he comes up to me, and he tells me, he says, Dr. DeVries, he said, I'm so sorry that I walked out on you. He said, but there was something that I had to show you. And he hands me a book. And it was, those spiral ring bound books?
Sure.
It was one of those, and it had been printed by the government printing office in Denver, Colorado. And he told us, he said that about 3 weeks before September 11th, every member of the Social Security Administration had to attend this training. And he said in the couple of months leading up to September 11th, he said every agency of the government had one of these trainings. He said, and the trainings were specific to the agency of government that they worked for. So the book that he handed me and the training that he went to was specific to what the Social Security Administration would do in the event of a major terrorist attack. And the picture on the cover of the training book and the scenario of the terrorist attack that they laid out in the training was a commercial airliner is hijacked and crashed into the Twin Towers.
Wow.
And it was a picture of one of the Twin Towers burning with an airplane flying into it. That was the picture.
3 weeks before the incident.
Yep.
Well, I'm certainly not surprised, but I had not ever heard that story before, so that's interesting.
Yeah. And of course, I did a little bit of research into that after that, and basically nobody in the government ever denied that. They said that, oh yeah, that we did those trainings, and that was one of 20-some, potential terrorist scenarios that, some smart people in think tanks somewhere had thought up as possible, as possible whatevers. And of course, that just happened to be the one that this gentleman's group, trained with.
Yeah.
But the government, that doesn't, that didn't mean it was premeditated. That just meant the government's so smart that, that they can predict potential scenarios, and it was just coincidental that one of the ones they predicted happened so quickly.
Oh, that's right.
To the training, yeah. So tell us about the unverifiable past of Barack Obama.
Oh boy, that once again, there are some things, and you just touched on one of them, the 911. But there's some crimes that are so wicked and so pre-planned by our alleged leaders that they can never confess to it. JFK assassination is one. People say, well, when are they going to solve that? We solved that 40 years ago. Jiminy. It took a few years, but probably by the time, a decade after November 63, we had those of us who paid attention to it, Jim Mars, Bob Groden, and Jim Garrison. I mean, the people that paid attention to the facts. We're not so smart. We just know how to read, and gradually put pieces together. But here we are, 54 years later, and now 55 almost, and they can never ever confess to it. Trump thought he was going to expose it, and suddenly somebody said, "No, you ain't," and bingo, there went that project. But there are some things that are so big, and 911 is one. The Murrah building is one, but them to have selected rather than elected a guy with no past, no history, a different name, a real name Barry Soetoro, suddenly comes in because anybody that didn't support him would be called racist. That's one of their big favorite buzzwords these days. But he was selected, and the number of voting precincts that not only had 100% for Obama, and back in 08 and 12 as well, but they had more voters vote for Obama than were actually registered. And I had those figures a few years ago. I can't read them to you now, but I can tell you that's what it showed. So that whole thing was so big. And then the birth certificate hit in June of 08. I remember well. The COLB, Certificate of Live Birth, it wasn't even a birth certificate, as was issued in Hawaii at the time, in August of '61, August the 4th, I believe. But the COLB was obviously written up by somebody, obviously an African American, under the age of 40 probably, and it was written up. And the reason I say that, and yours truly, I think, was the first one to spot this, but it's been all over the internet since, but I published it in American Free Press, because I grew up in the Mississippi Delta in the cotton country. There was no such term as African American in the 60s. In fact, if you called a black man an African, that was a great insult. And here on the Certificate of Live Birth, it says a race of the father, African. And it jumped right off the page at me. There's no such race as African. How can there be an African race when there are white Africans and black Africans over there right now? There's no race. The race, of course, is Negro. But the person who wrote up this COLB obviously didn't know that. They were too young. And so the race of the father was African. And bingo, that story that I then penned and published in American Free Press the following week took off, and many, many people began to spot it, and many, many other discrepancies with the Obama situation. But Obama destroyed, certainly came closer to destroying America than anybody, probably since Abraham Lincoln, as far as being the most unconstitutional president we ever had. The situation, though, once again, with the Obama deal and the birth certificate, is one that they can never face. They can never, ever face that. And it's obvious that they won't because of the control of the media. We don't have investigative reporters anymore. But what a juicy story for anybody that would have been allowed to say it. And unfortunately, all you got to do is walk down the street and talk to some of your neighbors around the block. And you'll find out that regardless of what Shannon and Jim Mars, the late great Jim Mars, and others have done about not only Kennedy but the 911 and the Oklahoma City and try to expose the truth, we can't get anywhere because the controlled mass media is too powerful. And that's the one that your neighbors are glued to every night. And that's the programming machine. I guess that's why they call it TV programming. But that's a machine that they are all victims of, and we're not penetrating it. I don't think we're winning at all on getting the truth out. The internet, of course, has been given us a giant step, but I still don't think we're winning.
Well, a lot of people don't realize it, but right now there are some serious internet regulation laws that are being passed in the European Union, and it's just a matter of time before they start being passed in our country probably as well.
I agree.
In fact, I'm already starting to get notifications from some of our web servers, telling me that the steps that they're going to be taking to be in compliance with these new European Union laws. And so even if they don't get passed in the United States, they're going to affect the way a lot of, excuse me, the way a lot of the web hosts in this country process information.
Mm-hmm.
And and even without this, of course, we've not even got into the censorship of Facebook or Google or YouTube or.
Well, speaking of the Obama situation, do you remember how fast they shut Trump down last year? When, year before last now, when he was still campaigning, and he brought up the Obama thing. I think it was like September or October before the election, pretty close to election time in November. And you may not remember, but he brought that up with all his infamous tweeting, and they shut him down, post haste. He just, and finally he even said publicly, tongue-in-cheek as it could have been, but in print it sounds sincere, where he said, okay, Obama was born in the United States. Obama was born in Hawaii. Because that's how guarded that whole secret has to remain. They've got to protect some of these things. They just cannot admit them.
Well, I do not remember which of the debates that it was.
You don't remember what?
I do not remember which of the debates that it was.
Oh.
And it might have been Lester Holt. Might have been the debate with Lester Holt, but I don't want to be quoted on that.
Okay.
But I remember Donald Trump looking right into the television camera and saying something to the effect of that he could answer that question truthfully. And he could also state any of a number of other facts that he knew. But doing so, he would be dead in the morning. And so he wasn't going to do it.
Good. That's pretty prudent planning, I reckon.
Yeah. And he basically said something to the effect, if he did not become a billionaire, without understanding how certain things work.
Yeah.
But he couldn't tell us because they would kill him if he dared.
Yeah. Well, do you listen to QAnon at all?
No, sir.
Well, he's apparently got some pretty good stuff on deep state and former CIA, I believe. But he has several people who report on what he reports on. He has reported that there have already been 7 attempts on Trump's life.
Wow.
Now, it's got to be divine intervention, for him to dodge it 7 times, and he didn't give us any details of what kind of attack it was or how far it proceeded before it was stopped. But anyhow, a lot of people praying for Trump, and I'm one of them. I think that he is sincere, but as I said a few minutes ago, he had no idea what he was getting into.
Count me into that list of supporters of the president who pray for him daily. We've got to pause now, and we need to hear a word from our sponsor, the American Free Press, and then we'll be back with our guest, investigative reporter, Pat Shannan. If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States. The things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative, independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories that are being censored and suppressed by the big money controlled media monopoly. And that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
Well, something that you had mentioned in your book, and I almost hate to bring it up.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I'm one of those people who probably don't... I'm one of those people who don't want to hear it.
Uh-huh.
But you had mentioned, the conservatism of Ronald Reagan being, that of a wolf in sheep's clothing.
That's a little known story
kind of hard
there,
to lose all of your heroes. I mean, I'll never forget the day I found out that John Wayne's real name was Marion.
Yeah, but at least it was an O-N. It wasn't an A-N.
Yeah.
But, back to Reagan, he's another guy. I think he was naive and as innocent as Trump when he went in 80. And he was force-fed George Bush as vice president, just as Kennedy had been force-fed with Lyndon Johnson. Now, in 1960, Kennedy had already told the Missouri Senator Stuart Symington that he would be his choice for vice president. That was already a done deal. Yet Hoover and Johnson, Hoover knew too much. Hoover was doing the dossiers on people way back before the FBI ever was doing it, in CIA. But they had all this information on Kennedy and his womanizing, and that's what they hung over his head. And Kennedy actually stayed up all night on the phone with Hoover and others, and finally Symington, 6 or 7 in the morning, he had to call Senator Symington and retract his offer. And they put Lyndon Johnson on the ticket, and now we know why, don't we?
Yep.
Well, the same thing happened in 1980. George Bush and Ronald Reagan hated each other. Oh, the voodoo economics that Bush accused Reagan of and all. I mean, it just didn't make sense for him to put George Bush on the ticket. But suddenly, 9 weeks later, on March the 30th, 1981, we understood why. When John Hinckley Jr. almost murdered Reagan and put George Bush in the White House. As it turned out, Reagan, of course, recovered. And the next 8 years, though, George Bush, actually, he was president for 12 years. He only had credit for 4. But if you look back on history, you will see the tune that Ronald Reagan was forced to change. And he quit talking about it. He quit complaining about the millions and millions, I think it was like 45 million at that time, abortions had been performed in the past decade since the Supreme Court's ruling. And he quit talking about other conservative things, which I think I mentioned there in the book. But that's because the heat was on him, And much like Trump, I just don't think Reagan had any idea what was really happening behind the scenes. I also maintain, and this is strictly Shannon talk, and I can't prove this one, but you and I, we're just having a little coffee table discussion here, and I'll throw this out just for people to chew on. But I maintain that in July of 2016, when Trump finally got the Republican nomination, I maintain that he marched into a meeting room or hotel room there with a group of the behind-the-scenes mobsters, and the exchange went like this. Mr. Trump, this is Governor Pence of Indiana. He's your new vice presidential running mate. I don't believe Trump had ever even met Pence. And I came to this conclusion a few weeks later when I did a little research on Pence's history. And he has been New World Order back before 9/11 even. You'll have to do a little search on it, but it'll blow your mind how deep into the other side. It becomes very obvious then, Ed, that he was chosen.
Right.
Pence was chosen, and it wasn't by Trump.
Well, do you know who Aubrey Vaughn is?
Oh, it sounds familiar. I can't place him, though.
Okay, Aubrey Vaughn was not Ronald Reagan's campaign manager, but he was involved in the Reagan campaign in 1980. He was George W. Bush's campaign manager the first time he ran for governor of Texas.
All right.
And he also is now and he was one of the leaders in the Christian Coalition and in the Moral Majority. He's a pastor in Houston. He's also one of the pastors who spent the better part of 80-some days in Indianapolis, Indiana, when Dr. Greg Dixon and the Indianapolis Baptist Temple was under siege by the federal government, if you remember that incident.
I was there. I covered that story.
You were there. I was there, too, for about 83 days. So how we missed each other, I don't know.
Oh, well, I wasn't there nearly that long. And are you talking about the final blow when they mowed it down?
Well, actually, this was when the members were still sleeping in the building for, was it 91 days, 92 days, waiting for the basically attempt to prevent the seizure.
That's what I was there for. And later he lost the building and everything. And, yeah, of course, I had Pastor Dixon on my radio show once or twice. But I was up there when Bo Gritz was.
Okay, I remember Bo.
Yeah, well, Bo came through and spoke, and everybody. In fact, they even burned the UN flag out on the steps of the church. Remember that one?
Yes, sir.
So I was there for that. I lived in Kansas City at the time, and spent not long, 2 or 3 days, just covering the story. I was writing for a Media Bypass magazine at the time.
Well, at the time, I pastored in a town that was just northwest of Houston, and Aubrey Vaughn was pastoring in Houston. And so we got to become good friends. And then after that whole situation, he and I would get together probably at least about once a week, and we continued to do that for a few years until I moved. But one day, Aubrey Vaughn had told me that on the night that Reagan had won the nomination, that they were sitting in the hotel, and they were basically bouncing names off of one another as to who Reagan's running mate was going to be, because they still hadn't settled the matter.
All right.
And they had another gentleman who was in one of the bedrooms of the suite who was basically, had the multiple TVs, and he was watching all the different, ABC, NBC, CBS. And he walks out into the main room of the suite where they were having their conversation, and he tells them, he says, you might be interested to know, CBS just reported that George Bush is our running mate. And Aubrey Vaughn says that Ronald Reagan stood up from his chair and basically looked at everybody. He said, well, I guess this matter's been settled for us. Don't worry. He's only one man. We'll work around him. Yeah,
well, once again, on March the 30th, Ronnie found out what they were really doing to him.
Yep. So what exactly was the connection between Hinckley and Bush? Because I've never heard of that before.
Oh, well, Jack Hinckley, John Hinckley Sr., he called him Jack, and George H.W. were running mates, partners in a few oil schemes. And he actually, Jack Hinckley also was some kind of ambassador to one of the African countries, as I remember. Anyway, pretty darn close to the Bush family. And, you know, what are the odds? John Hinckley
that
Jr.
connection for all these years? I guess because nobody was reporting it.
Yeah, but of course, even John Chancellor on that Monday night when Reagan was shot, he had this, and I think this you probably read this in the book, but it's so coincidental. What a coincidence that Scott Hinckley, John Jr.'s older brother, and Neil Bush are friends in Denver. In fact, they had a dinner engagement set up for tonight, for Monday night, and you know, what are the odds? Once again, John Hinckley Jr. was. It's so strange. I mean, I can't even imagine why the plotters would be so stupid as to use him. But obviously, it was another MK Ultra thing. It was a mind control thing, which again brings up that subject. Brings up Chapman and what was his name? Mark David Chapman that shot John Lennon.
Yep.
That would be December the 8th of '80. Well, Chapman was in Hawaii, living with his girlfriend out there, and he took off on December the 4th. Once again, these notes aren't in front of me, but I'm pretty sure it was the 4th that he left Hawaii. But he flew to Chicago and night flight, so he got in there on the 5th. And then the whole 6th is missing. There's no record whatsoever of December the 6th on Chapman's calendar, where he was or what he did. But on the 7th, then he flew to New York, and of course he shot Lennon on the 8th. Well, once again, he probably was meeting with some of the MK Ultra boys, getting his final programming done to knock out Lennon. But anyway, it follows the same pattern all the time. This, you know, the recent thing, this bogus shooting in Parkland, where the sheriff tells his deputies not to intervene, and then they want to call the deputies cowards. Well, the deputies weren't cowards; they were obeying instructions.
Right.
Oh, anyhow, you know, the list just goes on and on and on. But it's so difficult for Americans, especially those with the red, white, and blue fever, the ones who took the blue pill and won't take the red one. They cannot imagine how our government would never do that. They wouldn't stoop to that. And that being any of the atrocities that they pulled on us.
Well, Pat, we're just about out of time, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to stop the interview here. But let me just say that we could do a whole show on assassinations, the RFK assassination, the JFK assassination, the MLK assassination, and maybe even go back even further than that, maybe even go back into the Lincoln assassination, John Wilkes Booth. And I know that you're the man to give us the skinny on all of it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring you back for another interview, probably here in a few weeks. We'll set up a time to do that. But I definitely want to bring you back and definitely want to have you to speak to our audience again. And we're just going to go deep dive into all this stuff that we didn't have a chance to get to today. But wow, let me say, this was one of the most thought-provoking interviews that I've done in a long time. A lot of heavy information. It's going to take me a long time to process it. I know it's going to take our listeners a long time to process it too. So be sure to check out Pat Shannan's website, www.patshannan.us. Be sure to type Pat Shannan into Google. It pulls up all kinds of great stuff, articles that he's written through the years for any of a number of publications. It also brings up his own personal news site that he manages and runs. So be sure to do that. Be sure to go to our website, www.dixieheritage.net. While you're there, sign up for a free copy of our newsletter. We'll send it to you every Friday, absolutely free, no cost, no obligation. And we'll send you a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag, when you sign up for that newsletter. And so from all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, once again, thank you for spending this time with us. We look forward to being with you again next week. God bless.